Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SLMC Summer Series. And today we come to you from our brass band leadership lesson room, as we would call it today. And very, very excited that we have with us Howard Evans. And for those that have been following along during this summer, and those of you that would have seen Howard's wonderful piano recital a few weeks ago, you will realize that Howard was meant to be our special guest at Star Lake this summer. And so without that being possible, we're looking to engage Howard in a few different ways. So very excited about the piano recital that he was able to do, and very excited to sit and talk about brass band leadership today. So Howard, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much. It was a great discipline to put that recital together the other week. But as fortunately, lockdown has given me plenty of chance to do some playing, although I'm not sure whether to say good afternoon or good evening, because it is now kind of evening over here. I've done another Zoom video for our TMS for tomorrow, and it goes out tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I was recording it at night, and I think I've said good evening. So it'll be interesting to see what I said when I look at that tomorrow morning.
Well, I think that's kind of par for the course at this point. I'm not sure what time I reference all the time when we do these, but you know, I think it's afternoon now, and afternoon when people will see this as well. So that is helpful. But I'm very excited that you're here with us today, Howard. Honestly, I'm just excited that we get to chat for a little bit. You know, I feel like we get along pretty well, and happy to learn from you today on something that you know a lot about.
So well, I still think I know a little bit about it.
Well, I'm sure there'll be something that all of us can grab from it. So, you know, Howard, I'm not going to ask you any questions here at the start or anything like that. I'm basically going to give you the keys to the car at this point, and you can kind of roll. And then as questions come up, we'll stop and pause and kind of deal with some of those as they might pop up.
Okay, that sounds great. I mean, I've tried to look at this from the point of view that, you know, I should have been with you and was very much looking forward to that. And earlier in January, we spoke about brass leadership and a class in that kind of way. And I've tried to distill into some things that we can talk about, some of the things that I possibly would have introduced into that kind of class. And it's a hard one to do, because I hope that for people who are perhaps interested in it and haven't yet experienced it, or haven't had any conducting experience, that it's something that gives them something to take a hold of. But I also think that it's something that I hope that those who have perhaps got some experience can take some things out of it as well, in terms of kind of sort of pitching it. And I suppose the reasons for that is because it comes from my experience of teaching at Salford. I was responsible for the teaching, the conducting, and working with the student conductors from 2007 to 2015. And it's really interesting, because I actually think that during that time, and actually teaching conducting, the first year part of the course was for all the students. It was one of the modules that was available, and lots of the students, for instance, might have been looking to become music teachers. So they needed some of the basics of conducting to be able to take with them into those kind of roles. Second year was a bit more specialized, and the second year I used to work what I would call a conservatory style class, whereby, because of my piano skills, I used to be able to work as the rehearsal pianist. We would take, often we would take classical works to give a grounding in that, although there were lots of brass guys who were doing it. And I would also take piano works. Some of the most interesting piano works in that situation was to take some of the Bartók microcosmos, especially with their changes of time signatures. So there were all sorts of things that could be learnt there, and I used to be able to work as the rehearsal pianist. And then in the third year, I would have 3 or 4 conductors who I would mentor and tutor in front of the band or the wind band, and would work with them on a very kind of sort of close basis. We used to have one rehearsal a week where I would help mentor them during the rehearsal, either stand alongside them but be part of the rehearsal, and then they would have one rehearsal towards the end of the week without me breathing down their necks to be able to do their own thing. and then we would have kind of feedback sessions on that. Now, I've always said that I learned far more about myself and my conducting in that situation than, you know, maybe some of the students that I taught, although I did have a couple of students get in touch with me the other week, and it's a few years since they were my students, but a couple of them sent me a message via Facebook the other week to say they were somewhere sat having a nice drink and they were talking about me, and they just wanted to send me a message because they were so grateful for everything that I'd done for them. So kind of that was actually really nice and really kind. And the first question always, as a conductor, the first question always to consider was, and you can go into huge philosophical arguments, and in the purposes of this and in the purposes of the sessions that I had, you could only start to scratch the surface. But the first question was always, what is conducting? What is our perception of what conducting is? And there are always, sometimes they would have to think about it, and somebody would possibly be afraid to give you the answer, the most obvious answer being that of beating time. Conventionally, you know, I mean, people who aren't musicians, when you say to them, you're a conductor, they'll say, well, what do you actually do? I don't know if you've had that too many times, but people do. It's really interesting. But we would then sort of unpick it, and we would start to look at what it actually is. And to be a conductor, whatever kind of group you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with a professional group, whether you're dealing with an amateur group, whether you're dealing with a church music group, whether you're dealing with a Salvation Army band, once you start to unpick it, there are so many more other things that are part of being a conductor, which is why actually it's a great idea that you've called this brass leadership. But the conducting has so many other aspects to it in terms of the leadership that you give that affects your conducting. One of the things from a Salvation Army point of view that has always kind of reminded me of that is when you look to the past, we have all sorts of names kind of in the army world, and people who had all sorts of great leadership with great groups. It's quite fascinating because actually when you look historically at some of that, some of the folks who did those groups weren't necessarily the best conductors. Some of the conducting technique was actually in probably our eyes and kind of in our day, we'd look at it as if to say, and yet these people had a kind of charismatic leadership that brought the best out in the group and galvanized these groups and some of our songsters and some of our bands into kind of real potent forces and really good musical groups that went beyond the physicality of what some of these folks were doing with their conducting. And from a kind of philosophical kind of point of view, that sort of starts to scratch the surface about what leadership and what conducting is, and how it is so much more than some of the things that we end up thinking that it is, and how we make it work. I just kind of find it quite fascinating from that point of view as to where we've come from and the skills and the abilities, and how some of these people actually had so much more than necessarily their musical skills, which allowed them to become great leaders in so many ways. It's kind of really interesting. Yeah. So whilst, go on.
Oh, sorry, Howard. Yeah, and the one thing as you're talking about that, I think when you talk to a lot of people, you know, if you're a core bandmaster or whatever it might be, people often say, you know, who are the leaders? Well, actually leading the band, you know, is about, you know, is 10% of the job or 20% of the job, and it almost kind of, you know, what you're saying aligns with that there's so much more to it that makes it makes the success of the group, you know, matter even more. You know what I mean? There's a lot more that you have to bring to the table than just being able to navigate a rehearsal or, you know, beat time.
Absolutely. And I think you find that in Salvation Army groups. but I think it's also something that you find in non-Salvationist groups in lots of ways. Some of that depends on the organization of some of the groups, but I've never been involved with non-army groups. I've done some choral conducting. There was a time when I looked after a choir in Dorset. We used to do 2 or 3 concerts a year. And again, it wasn't just my musical capabilities that I needed to use to look after that group. They had a great committee, and it was a professional job that I was paid for doing, but the way you handle people, the way you looked after people, the way you understood the people that you're working with, always ends up being a part of what you do. And sometimes in these groups, we get it right in terms of how we look after them. Sometimes because you and I are human, we get it wrong. We don't always sometimes say or quite do the right things, especially in the heat of the moment when you're in front of your group and you're doing those kind of things. So it's quite something, and I think you find that in so many different walks of life. And in amateur and voluntary groups, actually, it's so much more important. People are there because they want to be there and because they want to enjoy themselves, and it's a pursuit. Or army-wise, we're doing it for the sense of calling, the sense of ministry reasons that we do, but it's still a voluntary thing that we do. And with that comes so many other things in terms of how we look after folks and how we deal with people.
That's absolutely, and that's I guess, yeah, it's just one part of the puzzle, right? One part of the great puzzle of putting it all together, and one part of figuring out what you need to do to become a great leader.
Having said that, we do need to look at some of the practicalities. Yeah. Now, some people might, it's really interesting, but if you notice what's actually happening here tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you're viewing this, I can't not use my hands when I'm talking. And so the whole business of conducting and the place of gesture and how we use our hands and what we do. One of the first things that I would do, again, with any type of kind of teaching situation in this way, is to actually get people to express themselves by using their hands without, and this is not kind of delving into what the beat patterns are, even before you start thinking about the technicalities of those kind of things. It's actually this ability to communicate with our hands. Now, some people, like I've always find myself talking with my hands. I can't help it. Some of it is not seen on the screen because they're kind of below the level of the camera. Maybe I ought to focus the camera on my hands for a few moments, but they kind of never stop. And actually, there are so many things you can actually just start to do lots of things and just create shapes and patterns and start to express yourself with your hands, because at the end of the day, as a conductor, once you start working on it and you look at some of the technical aspects, it's actually about doing that. And some of us are better placed at it. Some of us are less well placed at using our hands. There's that kind of sort of performance inhibition that will come, especially if you're in a classroom full of students and suddenly you're asked to talk to everybody with your hands, maybe without using any verbal gestures. But it's a really useful way of making shapes, making patterns, finding patterns in nature, drawing the shape of a tree. Or you can do this, and you can throw the stars into the sky and somebody else can understand what you're doing by what you do. And so for me, it's that kind of expressivity about what we're doing as conductors that starts the whole thing off. And I used to love to start to work and actually get people just making any kinds of gestures and just standing and talking with their hands and finding that sort of kind of posture with the body whereby you're sort of comfortable. There are so many things kind of sort of in that whole performance thing, which is a huge other area that we can end up going into, that applies across all the disciplines, but applies particularly conductors, because you are stood on your own, very visible and very vulnerable in front of the group that you're actually working with. So those are the kind of things that I would start with before we even went and looked at the beat patterns and those kind of things. One of the textbook that I still use, I have one or two people who still come to me at my home, although they haven't been able to recently. I have some people who do come to me wanting a bit of individual tuition in that kind of way. And one of the books that I still recommend is this. I don't know, let's get that right. Conducting Technique for Beginners and Professionals by Brock McElleran. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the title actually says for beginners and professionals. I've always found that you can, whether you're a beginner or a professional, you kind of never stop learning. And it's the kind of thing that I used in my teaching, that, and you'd suddenly read something and it would kind of impact you in a different way, in a way that you'd never read it before, and would maybe change something that you're doing or make you think about what you're doing yourself. There are so many things. Ron Holtz always used to recommend, I think I have it with me here. Ron Holtz used to recommend a book called The Modern Conductor by Elizabeth Green. I don't know whether that's kind of sort of still on the shelves, but there are so many books, and you can look at so many things online. The interesting thing, one of the exercises to do, whether you go and find a book, whether you go and work online, go and look at all the basic beat patterns and the diagrammatic forms that you get given for the basic beat patterns. It's quite fascinating because, in a way, when you examine a number of different sources, they all have very subtle differences. There are no 2-4-4 diagrams that are necessarily exactly the same in terms of where you place some of the beats. And I think it makes you think about what you're doing and why you're placing things in certain ways and finding what works for you. Although there are different things, you end up finding there are different things that work in different places. And I used to like to have an imaginary line down in front of me and a kind of tabletop that went across either side of me, so that I had two squares in front of me. And so I would draw my squares and I would draw my circles and I would visualize those spatial aspects in front of me, and then try and get my students to do the same thing, so that, because we're working in this empty space, but so that you have a kind of framework within which to work some of those kind of things and some of those patterns. And they're all, an examination of those will teach you all sorts of things about how these can be used and what you find comfortable. And it's very slightly different for everybody, although the principles are kind of sort of all the same. But those subtle differences are kind of quite fascinating. I can see you nodding, kind of in reaction to that.
Yeah, well, and just trying to think too is that some of those differences, as well would have to do with, just the physicality of yourself, body shape, if I'm 5'9" or 5'10", I can't have the same sort of pattern or gesture that someone that is 6'6", for instance, or something like that. So even those little bits of difference. And one of the things that I think, when you kind of get to the especially if you're just talking about 4-4, is even the argument of, so if you go down, and then do you stop back at that same corner, or do you keep going, or how does that work, there? But I think there's so many variables in that. But then when you look at the most successful conductors that there are, they don't all look identical either, right? There's so many interpretations on how that can do, and it just goes back to the earlier point. It's just about your ability to communicate whatever that subtlety looks like.
And watching some of these people and learning from them.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, I would get sort of sometimes contrasting videos of people who had kind of particularly orchestral conductors, people who would have quite big beat patterns and expansive gestures, and then contrast that with somebody like Gergiev, who sometimes uses a baton or a pencil as small as that, and does these minuscule movements. Now, it's very interesting as to whether we could apply that to some of our brass bands. It would be very interesting to see how psychologically some of our amateur groups would respond in those kind of situations. But yes, you get so many different things that kind of work, but that's where there's so many things to look at and so many things to examine that actually kind of sort of can give you an understanding of where some of those things go.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like you make I don't want to say you make a decision as to what your framework will be, but then, within that framework, just be as good as humanly possible within that framework that'll fit you and your ability to do things.
And whether, for me, kind of moving on from there, whether you're looking at conducting brass, whether you're looking at conducting wind groups, the first place that I used to like to start off with was turning whatever group I had by Christmas. I'd get a simple 4-part Christmas carol. We'd learn the parts again because of my piano skills. It was something that I could make happen, that I could do. Excuse me, I'm just knocking this slightly forward because I think it's moving back. It was something that I could do because I could use a keyboard, and I would turn the group, hopefully if we had kind of at least 10, 12 students, we would turn it into a small chorus, very simple 4-part, 4-phrase Christmas carol of some kind. And I would make them conduct each other and conduct the group. It's very interesting conducting chorally. And I think all brass band conductors should do more choral conducting. Because of the way, I suppose for all sorts of reasons, I would justify it for loads of reasons. I would justify it from the point of view that you don't know how to turn a phrase sometimes unless you sing it. Right. Even as a pianist, the whole thing about being a pianist is that playing the piano is a mechanical thing. You're pressing the key. It's a very percussive thing. How do I turn that melodic line, that singing line, into a musical phrase unless I can sing those notes? If every note sounds the same, if every syllable sounds the same. I mean, even the way I talk, if I was to talk the way some people conduct and the way some people play, I would be talking in a monotone like this, and my voice would not go up. We don't talk like that. Right. I mean, some of us are more expressive than others, but it's that whole business, that whole relationship. You've only got to read some kind of, again, some philosophical music books. It's that whole relation of music to verbal expression and song. Whether orchestral music has links to song in any kind of way, which often it doesn't, the whole sense of melody, color, sound, texture, all of those kind of things, basically you distill it right back to its origins, and it comes from this human expression, the human expression of the voice and putting things together and connecting with each other. And so I always think that we kind of have to go back to that. And I love being able to kind of verbalize things and start with some choral stuff and learning to do things. There are all sorts of exercises that I would use. And the interesting thing about these exercises, from a teaching point of view in my experience, and that's where I'm trying to draw on my experience of things that are kind of practical and work. I would use a number of these things in the first year. Hopefully they would be retaining them in the second year. By the third year, when they're actually stood in front of groups, I would find myself going back to some of the things that I did in the first year to remind my students of some of the basics of what they were doing, because they've forgotten some of those things in terms of what they were trying to do with the music. Right. And it's this business of being able to conduct a beat pattern with light, delicate emphasis, or a smooth emphasis, so that you take things through smoothly. It's doing the fast and the slow, it's doing the loud and the soft, and having gestures that convey those things in a mixture, doing the fast and smooth and the quiet, but just having a huge range, learning to make the gestures bigger, learning to make the gestures smaller. There was one verbal exercise that they often used to find difficult, and that's doing an exercise whereby you stress the beats in different ways. You go sort of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and show an accent on completely random and different beats. And I used to love to do lots of different things like that, and then I would have to remind about that when it came to kind of working with the groups. I often found I used to have to go back to some of those things when we were working in front of groups, kind of sort of much later on, that kind of sort of stressing of beats. One of the things that I liked about this particular book was, I'm sorry, my camera's rolling back again. I think it's settling down. Try that. We moved it earlier. One of the things that particular book that I referred to, there's a number of exercises in there in terms of what I would call kind of phrase conducting, and showing phrases so that you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Now, even a simple phrase like that, and how you show the phrasing, how you stop to show the phrasing, but you're actually still beating in time, and you're still, you are showing the timing, but you're also trying to show so much more than that. And those are the things that actually, when you're in front of a group, become sort of really difficult, because sometimes there's so much of a paradox. I used to find that there was a paradox with some of these things. You know, when the music wants to go quicker, sometimes, very often, your beats either need to be slower. So if you get something that's in 4 that ends up moving very quickly, doing slower beats in 2 actually allows the music to go quicker. And that's the paradox and the kind of sort of the opposite tension that kind of exists. I mean, I could talk about this for hours because I still find it fascinating. Yeah. But those are the kind of things that sort of happen. One of the lessons that I've never forgotten, and I've often recounted this as an illustration, the music school that I went to, that I spoke about, that I went to as a pianist when I was 14, during that week, I also took part in the orchestra that was going on that week on French horn. I also took part in the wind band that was going on. I was playing French horn in the orchestra, and I was playing bass clef euphonium with Dennis Wick in the wind band and doing Lincolnshire Posy. But it was a great experience, and there were a number of student conductors who were working with the orchestra under the tutorship of a UK conductor, Welsh conductor, very well known in those days by the name of Arthur Davidson. And one of the student conductors, one of the works that they had to prepare was the Elgar Enigma Variations. And so many of the conductors had their biggest problems with the most well-known movement out of Enigma Variations, and that's Nimrod. And I can still remember Arthur Davidson trying to get these conductors to beat a slow 3 without bouncing on the beat, without subdividing the beat, but showing exactly where the beat was, keeping the momentum without letting it get too big and uncontrolled, and show everything that was happening in Nimrod at the correct tempo. And they all struggled. they all struggled to actually make this work. And I always find it fascinating to watch people when they're conducting Nimrod, because I get taken back to that. It is one of the most difficult things to conduct with that kind of intensity. I've got a friend that you know very well, and I have to acknowledge this phrase comes from David. David's phrase that David uses for this particular situation, he talks about the viscosity of the beat. I can see you smiling. I hope you've heard him say that.
Yes, absolutely.
But I've never found a better expression for it. And it was David that kind of sort of started me off and kick-started me into doing the teaching at Salford. And that sense of the viscosity of the beat and how he talks about that and how you manage that, what it feels like. It's really interesting how all of those basic exercises that I spoke about a few moments ago come to play when you're dealing with a real piece of music, and actually are so hard, there's go the hands again, are so hard to apply when you're working in that kind of way. You're working with a real life group, and I don't care whether it's with an amateur group or a professional group. For me, the psychology of conducting is that you have to raise, even in your amateur groups, you raise their expectations over what, sometimes you can only be as good as they allow you to be, and it's this partnership that goes on with that. So that all comes out of that business of some of that phrase conducting that comes out of that book, that gives you lots of different things to do and to practice, so that when it comes to your scores, actually verbalizing your score, finding a way of expressing those things. I use verbalization in conducting and in my teaching all the time. I use it in my piano teaching. I use it in my conducting. I use it when I'm, one of the interesting things listening to Phil Harper the other day was Phil talking about being specific when he wanted musical shapes. I also use the word, and have done for a long time, musical shapes. And what I do myself, to talk about musical shapes, is that I will often verbalize and sing what I want in terms of musical shape, just to make sure that kind of sort of is understood. So this sense of verbalization, like that exercise that I gave, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, off. Now I just made that up there. But I would hope that if I was to do that in front of a group, even if I got them all to play on a single note, I could, as a conductor, I could get them all to play on a chord, find a chord, and we could work that. And we could work that in such a way that I could do that, and they would understand exactly what I was doing and would respond to that phrasing. And that's where the whole element of partnership, and I don't care how good or bad your group is, because I think sometimes people like to apportion blame to their group for not being able to do what they can. Whereas my challenge to me, with whatever group I've been working with, is to say, okay, they're not getting that. What can I do to make that happen, and for them to understand that time change, what I want there, how I want to do it, and to do all those kind of things. And that really for me is a kind of sort of passion for the conductor's responsibility. I hate it when we blame our groups, although there are times when they have to take the blame. But it's, from a conducting point of view, seeing as that's what we're talking about, I think it's understanding as conductors how we take responsibility for what we're doing and how we make those things happen in the group and where we take them. And so that kind of sort of takes me, there's loads of stuff that we could unpack, especially like if we were in a group situation. There's lots of exercises, and there's quite a lot of fun that we could have doing some of those kind of things, and doing some of the silly things that I make groups do, to be able to kind of sort of get to grips with some of those kind of things. Anything you wanted to add that occurred to you while I was
Yeah,
talking?
well, there was a couple of things that I had questions as we were going along, and you kind of answered some of them in the last little bit. Was kind of the vocal aspect of things and how much you would sing and demonstrate that in rehearsal, knowing that you were coming from a vocal perspective, but you kind of already hit that. I, two other, I guess, comments or questions. I'm not sure which they are, but let's say if you're conducting a brass group and you're conducting a vocal group, how does that change? How does your mechanics change depending on what that is? If it's a brass group or a vocal group?
That's really interesting. I hope there isn't too much difference. Right. And I mean, one of the important things for me in my leadership of Boscombe was the fact that and my passion as far as Salvation Army bands are concerned is that whatever else we do, the one and single most important thing that we ever do is to accompany the congregational singing. And like in lockdown, that's just, that whole sense of communication. And it was interesting because one of the things, and I would say this is where I think I always did this, but it was one of the things that reinforced it. In the Zoom meeting that we had the other week about Norman Bearcroft, yep. Brian mentioned the video that's been going around on YouTube, on Facebook, of Norman conducting his own arrangement of Richmond at the Royal Albert Hall. Yep. Now, everything that I see Norman doing there is what I have tried to do for many years. And sometimes at Boscombe, with some of the congregations and some of the big events that we've had, you could almost say it's been not as big, but it's been a bit like the Royal Albert Hall. And even on a normal Sunday, if it requires it, I have always led the congregation and I have always sung every single song so that what I'm doing with the band shapes that song and colours every single line and some of the words. I mean, there are times with the band when I could do this, push and away, and they would know exactly what I was doing in terms of what I call second syllable. And that release, if you listen to the way we sing, the way we release notes, the way we release words and when we're talking. So from a singing and a band point of view, I hope that it isn't different. Mm. Technically, I've always tended to conduct vocal music just with my hands. Right. The interesting thing is there that I'm actually a left-hander. At the age of 16, I started to conduct the school band. And because I hadn't seen evidence of too many left-handed conductors in those years, I taught myself to pick up the baton in my right hand so that it felt natural. Right. Now, what I actually find with bands is that that I do conduct and I do lead with my baton hand, but I can actually be ambidextrous. So like if I need to turn around to the congregation and I need to turn that way, I can simply shift the baton to my left hand and look after the congregation in whatever way. I can be quite ambidextrous. My right hand leads. When I'm conducting chorally, because I don't have the baton in my right hand, my left hand tends to lead. Okay. But in other ways, I would hope some of the kind of physicality of what I do is exactly the same. One of the compliments that David, when we worked together, because the relationship there started when I did my master's in conducting, whilst I was still with Amsterdam. I was looking, I knew that things were, I'd been there for five years. I knew that I would be doing into the 6th year, and there were because my contract was coming up, and I think they wanted a Dutchman to come and take over. I had a great time over there, and there were all sorts of reasons involved in that. But because of that, at that time, because I'd been working in the army sphere, I felt as though I needed to kind of look after my academic background. Because of that, I ended up having contact with David and Peter at Salford, and ended up doing my master's degree with David as my mentor. And So that's doing my master's, a kind of, what was I saying? Where did I start from?
One of the things that David would say about you in there.
Yes,
Yeah.
he would say that, that's it. He would actually say that my left hand was very independent. That's where I was going with that.
Yeah.
When we first met and when he saw me doing my stuff, he was actually on about the kind of the independence that my left hand actually had. And I think that's because I'm left-handed, and I taught myself. Go on, what's one of the things that he would say?
No, I was just finishing your sentence. But funny enough, some of the guys that are in the staff band that would have been around, at Star Lake when you were here 14 years ago now. Yeah. So I think you did Glorifico Aeternum as one of the pieces. And you're kind of going through, the 10/8 bit at the beginning that, some of the band is kind of in 5/4, and the tubas were struggling to come in. You're like, okay, well, I can help you out. And it was just one of those things where, like, your right and your left hand were doing two different things, but your left hand was able to give the tubas exactly what they needed. So there was absolutely no way they were going to get it wrong, right? So that's just a good example, and people still talk about it, right? Which is kind of funny.
I didn't realize that was.
Well, okay, maybe it's like one or two people that talk about it, but at least someone does. Yeah.
Well, that's nice, because that's exactly the situation I was talking about earlier, where, okay, they're not getting it right. How do I help them? What can I do as a conductor? I think it was one of those where my left hand had to make a downbeat to put them in the right place, whilst my right hand did an upbeat after that. Or I could probably point to that bar in the score. But yes, I mean, I remember that, and that illustrates my point from earlier. It's no good me screaming at the bassist, can't get it right, can't get it right, get it right, boys, get it right. What can I do as a conductor to get it right? I can answer one of your other questions in terms of talking about the verbal stuff and those kind of things. But all of that previous stuff deals with the kind of way in which I hope I'm the same vocally and brass, but I am kind of I do think that I'm slightly ambidextrous. And as I say, David was always complimentary about the fact that my left hand was quite independent. The interesting thing, talking about the verbalization and how I do that, one of the things about, and like that whole thing about gesture and what we do as conductors, and gesture has a huge psychological impact on our groups and what they do. Part of my master's study was the study of gesture and visual perception in performance. Now, again, that's a whole other area that I don't need to go off in a tangent, but just to say, the way we take in information, and especially musical information, even when we go to concerts as listeners, the way studies show that the way we take in most of our information is visually, and is not. We think it's with what we hear, but we are so much more affected by what we see. And sometimes I think there are probably conductors, when we go to concerts, there are conductors. If you were to take away the conductor and just listen to the performance, you would hear something completely different, because either the charisma or the way in which the conductor gets in the way of the music, sometimes it can go from one end of the extreme to the other, can actually have an impact visually on what you perceive with your ears. Therefore, we have to understand as conductors that we take in so much information by gesture. Now, one of the things, talking about the verbal bit that you brought up there, that I was going to discuss, was this business of how we fix things. Sometimes we have to fix things verbally. Sometimes there's no other way of doing it. One of the interesting things with my third year students, and some of them used to get so frustrated with it, and I used to put this into practice with Boscombe as well. And with any bands that I conduct, it's something that I would still do with any band. The student conductors would be trying to fix something, and they'd start to explain, and it was the sessions where I was stood alongside them. And, even sometimes some things, how do I, they've got a pause on the third beat of the bar, and somebody, solo euphonium, picks up on the fourth beat of the bar. The rest of the band has a crotchet rest, and they all come in on the first beat in the next bar. And the conductor would start to explain what they're going to do there because it went wrong the first time. I'd say, don't say anything. And I'd stand in front of the group and I would say, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. I want you simply to watch. And my phrase was, do what I do. And much to the conductor's frustration, because they were obviously learning and I should have known what I was doing, I would do it. I wouldn't explain what I was doing. And because I was stood in front of them, the students would sometimes be a bit more alert and they'd be a bit kinder to me than they were to their student peers. That was always a hard one. That's something else to come to the leadership thing, because, you know, all of a sudden they're stood in front of their peers and asking them to do things. But it was a question of do what I do. I'm not going to explain this. I'm not going to verbalize this. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with my hands. You have to work. And what I'm doing is absolutely clear, but it's that relationship whereby we have that connection, whereby you guys simply do what I do and we do it together. And by gesture, without saying anything, is to get your groups to understand at whatever level. And that's where that kind of stuff, it doesn't matter what level you're working at. It doesn't matter whether you're working at a beginner level or whether you're working at a professional level. The business of how you communicate and how you communicate with your hands, and you allow your groups to function and to do things without having to talk to them, but just by using your hands and making it happen through the use of gesture, is one of the most important things. One of my other phrases, and sometimes, you know, in rehearsal with Boscombe, I'd do something, you know, especially if we were warming up with Boscombe for 17 years. The only way I ever warmed up with Boscombe was with 10 minutes of hymn tunes, to get the band sound going, to get them going, to get them used to connecting with me. I would always, you know, we always ignored whatever the markings were on the tune, and I would try and phrase it in such a way and give some colours and give indications of those colours in whatever way I wanted. Get the balance of the band, let them hear what I was going, get the tongue out of the way so that we're producing air, and then introduce that. We did that every time. But there were some weeks when we'd start doing that and I'd say, conductor makes useless gesture. Because you do something and it doesn't mean anything because it made no difference to the way that they played. And I'd have to say, let's go back and do that again. Or you make a gesture in a piece, or you do something in a piece. Conductor makes useless gesture. Guys, you just weren't responding. Please do what I do, without telling them what it was or what I was trying to do. Sometimes it's that short phrase and actually trying to get your group, you know, for everybody's sake, it kind of creates a response and an integrity in the music that you end up developing as a conductor with what you do. And actually it makes your rehearsals far more efficient. You waste far less time having to explain things to them. And I remember going and doing some conducting tuition for another group with a conductor who just, it was in the Salvation Army context as well, with a group who'd just taken on a new conductor. And the idea was that I went to give some mentoring and to help. And when I've been involved in that situation, it's a very dangerous situation when you're working with a conductor in front of their own group. There is a credibility thing whereby you're trying to look after that person, and you're trying to help them, and you're trying to show them ways of doing things without making them feel too vulnerable, because it's vulnerable enough being stood in front of a group. And yet it's also one of the best ways to learn. But my challenge in that situation was always to say to the group concerned, he and I, or you and I as conductors, can only do what you guys sat in front of us allow us to do and to connect with you. And this is as much about you learning what your role and responsibility is in the group, as well as us learning our craft as conductors and what we're doing. And again, I just think whether you're at the beginning of what you do or you're quite experienced at what you do, that's the challenge for all of us all the time in terms of the groups that we stand in front of, and how we make that work and how we develop that relationship. It led to some very frustrating moments for my students, and sometimes the penny didn't drop for quite a long time. One of the interesting things was that, and I learned myself from this, one of the best ways that you can learn, whatever people say to you, I always found that one of the best ways to learn was to video yourself and to view yourself. Now, the way I used to do this for myself, particularly with Boscombe and with other things, I used to hate watching things on Facebook and all the rest, social media afterwards, because it wasn't the live experience, and the sound that you get wasn't the sound. I knew what I heard that night. I knew where the clips were. I knew the things that perhaps didn't go as well as other things. But the one thing that I used to do sometimes, I would make myself do kind of every so often. I'd make myself look at one of the videos and turn the sound down so I couldn't hear it. And as long as the camera was kind of sort of, if it was just a general and the camera stayed in the same place, I would try and watch it, and I would look at what I was doing to see if I was getting into any what I would call bad habits or things that weren't necessary, right. And to watch and to see if my conducting was as efficient and as creative and as communicative as it was meant to be. And with my student conductors, I always found that they learned far more and understood what I was saying to them once they'd seen it and understood it for themselves. I could talk to them till they were blue in the face, and it made no difference. We'd sit and have reflections, and we'd have the reflective stuff. I'd reflect back to them from my notes, you know, how do you think you did there? What could you have done? But it never made any difference until they actually saw it for themselves, and sometimes went back to all of those basic exercises. And so for all of us as conductors, whatever level we're at, there's that business of how we reflect. One of the things that I did for my masters, again, that was just the best learning experience that I could have asked for, was I kept a diary for the year. Every single rehearsal, and I was working with other bands. I was working with the staff band in Amsterdam, and I was working with Boscombe. And I've got this huge folder of my reflective practice. Right. And after every rehearsal, I got into the discipline of writing down what had done well, what had gone well, what had not gone well, what things had I avoided dealing with as the conductor because I wasn't sure of what I was doing. Right. Very interesting from that point of view to go back and to read some of those things, because as a conductor, you know yourself. And these days, I would always be honest. Guys, I need to go away and think about that. I'll come back with a solution for that next time. Or, guys, there are some intonation issues in that particular bar. I need to go away. It's no good me stood here examining that chord here because there's a note and there's a function of one of those notes in that chord. I need to go away. I need to analyze that chord. I will come back. I will fix that next time because I need to go away and do some homework. These days, I would be far more open and honest. And even as far as my conducting is concerned, if I make a mistake, sorry guys, that was my mistake there. Let's do it again. I've seen conductors who try and cover their mistakes with bluster and try and cover their mistakes by blaming on something that happened in the band. Let's just do that again. I think we need to do, whereas it actually is quite, the stupid thing is every single guy in the band knows that it was you. Why not just be, we lose nothing by not being open and honest and saying, guys, I'm really sorry. That was my mistake there. Or I said the wrong thing there. I put my hand in the wrong place there. And actually, the danger is that when you make your group more interactive, with all the things that I've spoken about earlier, when you make your group interactive with what you do and the way you shape and the way you phrase and responding to what you do, in concert performance, it becomes even more a responsibility that the band, because the band are not on autopilot. You know, sometimes I say, guys, in that piece tonight, I could have turned you on at the beginning, pressed the remote, let you go on. It made no difference what I did. But when you become more interactive and you keep that relationship going, and as conductors, we know when it really works and when it's working like that. When you feel that if I was to stand on my head, they would still be with me. And, you know, I've had moments, particularly with Boscombe, that have been absolutely fantastic in terms of how they've responded to what I've been trying to communicate. And those are the performances that really come alive. But then we have a responsibility as conductors, because in those moments, you have to be absolutely on top of your game, because if you make a mistake, the chances are that it's going to impact on what they're doing, because suddenly something happens and they've lost the thread because you've done that. But I've never been afraid of saying, sorry guys, that was my mistake tonight. I only made one mistake tonight. How many did the rest of you make? You know, that's a lot of stuff about that. But that just scratches the surface for me of what I think is the psychology of conducting and the relationship that we have with our groups and the way it works, and how can I do it more effectively in that kind of way.
It's interesting too. I think we've all been in those rehearsals where clearly the conductor makes a mistake and it's like, oh, actually, I just want to touch on this one thing. But yeah, it's way easier at this point. Well, sorry guys, that was my bad. We're gonna go back and do that for me, just to make sure that it's simpler. And honestly, I think it gives you a little bit more credit with the band.
It's very interesting because that highlights for me what sometimes with our conducting is the difference between rehearsing and preparing for performance.